This initiative, the president said, is crucial for fostering economic growth and enhancing bilateral relations between the two West African nations. The president made this declaration during a press briefing after a meeting with Mali's transitional president, General Assimi Goïta, in Bamako. The discussions focused on streamlining trade procedures, eliminating bureaucratic bottlenecks, and enhancing cooperation between the two countries' transport and custom agencies.
We discussed issues of how we can strengthen our defense cooperation in the light of the fight against terrorism.
Every empire has its foundation. Rome had iron, Britain had coal, America had oil. The next global foundation is gold. And once again, the heart of that story beats in Africa. For centuries, the world mined African soil for treasure, but left the continent in poverty. Ships once carried West Africa's gold to European mints. Today, planes still fly bullion to London and Zurich, where prices are decided far from the lands that produce it. But that pattern is beginning to break. In Accra and Bamako, a quiet financial rebellion has begun. Ghana, long called the Gold Coast, is now the continent's second-largest producer. In 2024, its output rose beyond 130 metric tons, powered by new state-backed refineries and community mines that sell directly to the Bank of Ghana. Those bars no longer leave the continent raw. They stay to strengthen national reserves. Across the Sahel, Mali, Africa's third-largest producer, has followed the same path. The transitional government nationalized strategic stakes in foreign-run mines and created the Mali Gold Office, requiring that 35% of refined output remain in local vaults. For the first time in decades, two neighbors are speaking the same language of self-value. Our resources will build our own economies. No more exporting poverty. Those words from a Ghanaian minister captured a new continental mood. The message spread quickly. From Niamey to Ouagadougou, officials studied the Ghana-Mali model, require on-site refining, sell a fixed share to national reserves, and use gold to back local currencies. Economists call it commodity-backed sovereignty. Citizens call it Africa's gold awakening. The figures are staggering. Together, Ghana and Mali sit on more than 2,000 metric tons of proven gold, worth over $130 billion today and several trillion when measured against full downstream potential in refining, jewelry, digital payments, and infrastructure. Add artisanal fields and future discoveries, and analysts project a resource base that could influence up to $40 trillion in global derivative value within a generation. Western financial capitals have noticed. Gold traders in London whisper about the Accra effect, as prices surge whenever Ghana holds bullion instead of exporting it. Rating agencies warn that West Africa's new policies could redirect billions from Western vaults to African treasuries. For once, the continent is not chasing foreign investors. It is creating financial gravity. This movement is not isolation. It is balance, a long-delayed correction of an unequal system. In marketplaces across Kumasi and Bamako, people feel a new pride. Posters read "Our gold, our future." Students discuss how a regional gold-backed currency, the Afro Reserve, could stabilize prices and reduce dependence on the CFA franc or the US dollar. International partners are repositioning. The UAE has opened direct purchase channels with Ghanaian refineries. India has signed agreements to boost its jewelry sector. China has pledged financing for a joint West African bullion exchange. Each deal chips away at the century-old pattern in which value left Africa before Africans could benefit. History moves slowly until it moves all at once. The gold revolution is no longer a dream whispered in independence speeches. It is the sound of furnaces burning across a continent determined to mint its own destiny. When Ghana and Mali changed how they handled gold, few in Washington, Paris, or London paid attention. But the tremors spread faster than anyone expected. Within months, European refineries began reporting shortages. Traders in London found it harder to secure deliveries that had always arrived without question. Prices surged, but not because of war or inflation, because Africa had chosen to keep what was rightfully its own. In the corridors of the World Bank and the IMF, quiet meetings turned into emergency briefings. Reports warned that if African nations continued to stockpile gold and demand local refining, Western currencies could face unprecedented pressure. The US dollar, backed by confidence more than resources, suddenly looked vulnerable in the face of real gold reserves rising elsewhere. Gold, the ancient store of value, had become a weapon of sovereignty. Financial analysts in New York began calling it the Akromali shock. They compared it to the 1973 oil crisis when Arab nations used energy as leverage. Now, Africa was doing the same, but with the world's oldest currency. The West had grown comfortable with control. For decades, African countries exported raw materials while importing inflation. They sold cheap and bought dear. But the script flipped when Ghana and Mali decided to sell only refined bullion at global prices. The numbers are revealing. By early 2025, Ghana's decision to hold back just 20% of its annual gold output from foreign markets wiped over $12 billion off the books of major Western trading houses. Mali's export tax on unrefined gold raised $1.8 billion for national infrastructure, money that once left the continent forever. The effects rippled outward. Mining conglomerates based in Toronto, London, and Paris began losing concessions to local companies. African engineers who once worked abroad returned home to manage refineries. Entire new industries, logistics, security, and technology grew around domestic gold processing. Meanwhile, Western banks faced a dilemma. Their vaults depended on steady African supply chains. As shipments declined, so did their leverage over African currencies. In Washington, a senior policy analyst described the situation bluntly. If Africa stops exporting gold the way it did, Western liquidity contracts. That's the quiet truth no one wants to say out loud. Television networks in the U.S. began airing worried reports about the new gold bloc. The phrase referred to African and Asian economies aligning around gold-backed trade. China, India, and the UAE had all signed partnership agreements to purchase directly from African refineries, bypassing Western middlemen. For ordinary Africans, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Farmers in Ghana who once received almost nothing for the minerals under their land now had access to local investment funds backed by gold profits. In Mali, new schools, roads, and solar grids were being built with royalties that used to vanish overseas. But in Western capitals, the tone shifted from skepticism to alarm. Editorials accused African nations of economic nationalism. Analysts warned of resource fragmentation. Yet underneath the diplomatic language was something simpler: fear. Fear that the balance of power was changing. Fear that the foundation of Western economic dominance, cheap African resources, was cracking. By mid-2025, the IMF projected that Africa's gold-backed reserves could surpass $500 billion within 5 years if the trend continued. That number terrified global investors. It meant that Africa could start lending money, on its own terms, to the same nations that once dictated its policies. And it wasn't just gold anymore. The movement was contagious. In Niger, uranium exports were being renegotiated. In the Congo, cobalt bans were reshaping the global tech industry. In Tanzania, lithium partnerships with China had sidelined U.S. companies. Africa was speaking in one language: value. The streets of Bamako and Accra echoed with a new pride. Young people shared videos online celebrating the gold revolution. Hashtags like #AfricaRises and #OurWealthOurFuture began trending across the continent. And while the West debated, Africa was already building. The newly proposed African Gold Exchange, a unified trading platform for the continent, was being drafted by economists from Ghana, Mali, and Kenya. The plan was bold: list Africa's own mineral prices, independent of Western indexes. If successful, it would mark the end of centuries of price control from London and New York. The tremor had become a shift, and the world was beginning to realize that the age of African dependency was ending. By 2026, the tremors from Ghana and Mali's bold decision had turned into a continental wave. African nations were no longer asking for permission, they were setting the terms. From the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea, leaders began echoing a single call: we will no longer export poverty. The African Union, once viewed as symbolic, became a powerhouse of coordination. New trade frameworks were drafted linking mineral wealth to industrial goals. Africa was not just a supplier of gold, oil, and cobalt anymore. It was becoming an architect of global finance. Economists in Washington called it the African repricing. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa's true value was being recalculated, not in aid, but in assets. The global reaction was swift. Western companies began lobbying for new access agreements, offering partnerships instead of aid packages. But the continent had learned from history. The era of dependency had ended, and the language of diplomacy had changed. Now, Africa's message was clear: we trade, not beg. The golden era begins. Mali's new central gold bank announced plans to issue Africa's first gold-backed digital currency, the Sahel coin, tied directly to verified gold reserves. Ghana joined soon after, integrating the system into its financial sector. The move sent ripples through global markets. The U.S. Federal Reserve and European Central Bank called emergency meetings as speculative pressure mounted against the dollar and euro. For the first time in decades, traders looked toward Africa not for raw materials, but for monetary stability. Meanwhile, African media exploded with pride. Headlines read, "Africa owns its gold." Documentaries showcased local miners who had once worked for foreign corporations, now forming cooperatives and selling refined bars through state-certified exchanges. Across the continent, something deeper was changing, not just economics, but identity. The world began to see Africa as a force of creation, not extraction. The West struggles to adapt. In Europe and America, policy think tanks published reports titled The African Challenge. They warned that Western supply chains, from smartphones to solar panels, were at risk if Africa continued nationalizing production. Gold was just the beginning. Copper from Zambia, cobalt from Congo, bauxite from Guinea, and uranium from Niger were next. Each resource represented another brick in Africa's new economic fortress. The Western narrative of helping Africa develop no longer resonated. Africa didn't need saving, it needed respect. In Paris, a major newspaper asked a question that once seemed unthinkable. Has France lost Africa forever? Because the numbers were undeniable. African gold reserves were projected to surpass $3 trillion in verified value by 2030. If refined domestically and traded internally, that number could triple. For the first time, Africa's economic destiny was in African hands. The Continental unity at the 2027 African Economic Congress in Accra, something historic happened. Leaders from over 40 nations signed the Pan-African Resource Charter, a unified declaration that all strategic minerals, energy resources, and agricultural exports would prioritize intra-African trade before leaving the continent. The symbolism was immense. This was not just an economic document, it was a statement of sovereignty. Delegates from the Caribbean, South America, and Asia attended as observers. They saw what the world was witnessing, a continent reclaiming its future. In a speech that went viral worldwide, Ghana's finance minister said, "We are not closing our doors to the world. We are simply saying, from now on, Africa sets its own price." The applause echoed like thunder. The new African vision. By 2030, the results were visible from space. New highways connected gold-rich regions of Mali to Ghana's ports. Solar-powered refineries lit up what was once barren land. African tech hubs designed digital trading platforms linking Nairobi, Lagos, and Accra. Foreign investment still came, but on new terms. Instead of extracting wealth, investors had to share ownership, build infrastructure, and train local workers. The balance of power was shifting, not with guns, but with contracts. The African story was no longer one of suffering. It was one of strategy, vision, and courage. Across the world, young Africans in the diaspora began returning home. They wanted to be part of something historic, a renaissance that generations had only dreamed about. The global reckoning Western commentators finally admitted what was happening. Africa was no longer a resource base, it was an equal player. In trade, in policy, in diplomacy, and in technology. Global investors who once dismissed Africa as risky now called it the center of 21st century growth. African currencies gained strength, backed by gold and trust. A new world order was forming, one built not on dominance, but on balance. Africa had taken back its story. Its people had turned pain into power and exploitation into excellence. And as the sun set over the Sahel, reflecting golden light across the refineries of Bamako and Accra, the world realized a truth that could no longer be denied. Africa's time had come, and nothing could stop it now.
Welcome to African Spotlight 24, your premier source for news and current affairs from across the continent. We're glad you're here. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe, like, and turn on notification to stay up to date with the latest news and analysis. Your support helps us reach more people. Disclaimer: the content of this video is based on credible, publicly available information and is intended for educational, analytical, and informational purposes only. African Spotlight 24 does not promote hate, violence, misinformation, or political unrest. Our goal is to deliver thoughtful insights, highlight local voices, and encourage informed conversations throughout Africa.